You will never be good enough for me, he'd said it so casually, a throwaway line as he buttered his toast, that it had landed with the dull thud of a dropped pebble rather than the seismic shock it should have been. I was maybe 10, a scrawny thing with knees perpetually scabbed, and his words, so devoid of malice yet so laced with finality, had echoed in the quiet kitchen for years. My mother, already halfway out the door for her morning shift, had just hummed in response, a noncommittal sound that meant, "Don't bother me with your childhood dramas." That was our normal. A veneer of domesticity over a deep, unsettling current of neglect. My childhood bedroom, smelling faintly of dust and disappointment, was my sanctuary, a place where I could draw my imaginary worlds and pretend the hushed arguments that bled through the thin walls were just background noise. He'd arrived like a well-dressed phantom, a widower with a polished smile and a way of speaking that made you feel both seen and utterly insignificant. My mother, adrift in her own quiet sorrow, had latched onto him like a life raft. He brought with him a sense of order, a sharp, almost sterile tidiness that began to creep into our already subdued household. But beneath the veneer of improvement, there were cracks. I remember once, when I was 12, finding a crumpled bill in his jacket pocket, a significant sum of money for a child my age. I'd innocently asked if I could have it to buy a new book. He'd snatched it back, his face hardening, and delivered a lecture on responsibility and the value of money, his voice tight with a possessiveness that felt alien. My mother had been present, watching the exchange from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She didn't intervene. Later, I'd overheard him on the phone, bragging to a friend about how he kept me in line, how he managed me. The words were casual, but they settled in my gut like stones. Then there was the time I'd accidentally broken one of his antique glasses, a delicate, hand-blown piece. I'd stammered an apology, my hands shaking. He hadn't yelled, not then. Instead, he just looked at the shards on the floor, then at me, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face. "That's a shame," he'd purred, his eyes glinting. "Such a clumsy child. You'll have to be more careful, won't you? Wouldn't want anything to happen to." The unspoken threat hung in the air, thicker than the scent of lemon polish he so meticulously applied to every surface. My mother had been busy in the garden, humming a tune that was just a little too loud, a little too cheerful. Each incident, a tiny chip in the foundation of my childhood, was met with her practiced silence. I learned to be quiet. I learned to observe. I learned to store away every condescending remark, every dismissive glance, every subtle threat, like carefully catalogued artifacts of a life I didn't choose. The day it all fractured began like any other Sunday. The air was thick with the scent of brewing coffee and the oppressive quiet that often descended when he was home and my mother was somewhere else, lost in her own world. I was in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, the worn pages a familiar comfort. He walked in, a newspaper folded under his arm, his usual air of detached authority radiating from him. He sat down opposite me, his gaze not on the headlines, but on me. I felt it before he spoke, a prickle of unease. "You're being too loud," he stated, his voice flat. I'd been quietly humming to myself, a soft, almost inaudible melody. I stopped, my throat tightening. I wasn't. I was just humming, I managed, my voice barely a whisper. He scoffed, a dry, rasping sound. "Don't argue with me. You always have to have the last word. Always raising your voice. It's disrespectful." He stood up then, the newspaper rustling. My mother entered the room, carrying a tray with mugs of tea. She saw him standing over me, his posture accusatory, and me shrinking into the sofa. She didn't ask what was happening. She just set the tray down on the coffee table, her movements precise and automatic. He ignored her, his eyes fixed on me. "You think you can just do whatever you want in this house?" he demanded, his voice rising, but not in anger. It was a cold, controlled fury. I felt a surge of something, injustice, fear, a desperate need to be heard. "I wasn't doing anything," I said, my voice trembling, a little louder than I intended. That was it. The trigger. He moved with startling speed. One moment he was standing, the next his hand was on my arm, his grip like iron. He yanked me up, his face inches from mine, his eyes burning with a chilling intensity. "You will not raise your voice at me," he roared, the sound tearing through the quiet room. And then, he struck. Not a wild, flailing blow, but a sharp, controlled slap that cracked against my cheek. The force of it sent me reeling back, my head snapping sideways. The pain was a white-hot S. Hawk, but it was nothing compared to the searing betrayal that followed. My mother. She stood frozen, the tray still in her hands, her eyes wide. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched. Watched him hurt me. Watched him silence me. The silence in the room after the crack of his hand was deafening. He held my gaze for a moment longer, a smug, triumphant glint in his eyes, before releasing me with a shove. He then turned to my mother, a flicker of something like justification crossing his face, and gestured vaguely towards me. "See what I mean?" he said, his voice now unnervingly calm, as if he'd simply corrected a minor household infraction. My mother, her face pale, finally set the tray down. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at him. She just looked at the floor. I felt a cold, hard knot of resolve form in my chest. It wasn't about the pain. It was about the complicity. The utter, suffocating silence. For weeks, I existed in a fog of quiet resentment. Every time I saw him, the sting of the slap and the emptiness of my mother's silence were a constant, burning reminder. I ate in my room. I studied in my room. I spoke only when absolutely necessary, my voice carefully modulated, devoid of any emotion that could be construed as defiance. I began to research. Late at night, under the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I scoured legal websites, read through countless forums, and dug into property records. It was a slow, meticulous process, like an archaeologist uncovering ancient ruins. I learned about trusts, about wills, about the intricacies of joint ownership and the legal ramifications of marital assets. I paid particular attention to the clauses surrounding prenuptial agreements and the dissolution of property in cases of domestic disputes. He believed himself untouchable, a man of consequence who dictated the terms of everyone's life. He thought his authority was absolute, reinforced by my mother's meek acquiescence. He was wrong. I remembered a conversation, overheard months ago, where he'd been bragging about how he'd secured his financial future by putting the house, the one my mother had inherited from her parents, into a separate trust, with himself as the sole beneficiary, a move designed to protect it from any potential future financial missteps on her part. He'd framed it as a responsible measure. I'd simply filed it away. Now, that knowledge became my weapon. I found an old, forgotten lawyer's card in the bottom of my mother's desk drawer, a relic from her first divorce. I contacted him. I didn't tell him the whole story. I didn't need to. I presented a carefully constructed narrative, a series of questions about asset protection and beneficiary rights, using hypothetical scenarios that mirrored our reality with unnerving accuracy. He listened patiently, his voice measured and professional. I asked about the specific wording of trusts, about the implications of his position as sole trustee, and about the legal pathways for challenging such arrangements. I learned about the inherent biases in legal systems, and how they sometimes favored the party demonstrating more stability and foresight. He thought he was the only one playing the long game. The day of reckoning arrived without fanfare. It was a Tuesday, the air crisp and cool. My stepfather was at his golf club, my mother was at her volunteer job. I had called in sick from my part-time work. I spent the morning meticulously organizing my belongings into boxes. Then, I waited. He arrived home before I expected him, a rare occurrence. I heard his car pull into the driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel. I took a deep breath, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. I walked to the front door, not with fear, but with a quiet sense of purpose. He unlocked the door, his usual air of proprietorship about him. He stopped dead when he saw me, standing there with my boxes. His face, usually so smooth and composed, contorted into a mask of confusion. "What is all this?" he demanded, his voice laced with irritation. I held up a single, folded document. It was a copy of the trust deed, with specific clauses highlighted in yellow. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said, my voice clear and steady. "And it seems there are a few irregularities in the way this trust was established. Particularly concerning the sole beneficiary clause and the absence of any provisions for other occupants who were present before its inception." His eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing his face. He tried to snatch the document, but I pulled it back. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice never wavering, "I've filed a counterpetition. Based on the findings, and with a significant amount of evidence regarding your management style, a judge has granted me temporary sole guardianship of the property, pending a full review." The smugness drained from his face, replaced by a dawning horror. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking suddenly older, smaller. He stammered, "You can't, this is my house." I simply shook my head. "Not anymore," I said, my gaze unwavering. "You built your foundation on silence and control. But sometimes, the quietest people have the longest memories, and the most effective ways of getting what they're owed." He stood there, speechless, his face a picture of utter defeat. He looked around the hallway, at the boxes that represented my departure, and a chilling realization dawned. He had underestimated me. Profoundly. The fallout was swift and messy. His phone began to buzz incessantly within minutes of him realizing I was serious. My mother, alerted by a frantic, nonsensical text from him, arrived home to find me calmly loading my last box into my car. She looked at him, then at me, her face a picture of bewildered distress. He tried to spin a narrative of betrayal, of me being ungrateful, of me turning her against him. He even roped in his sister, a woman who had always adored him, painting me as the villain. But the legal documents, the cold, hard facts, spoke for themselves. He wasn't just losing the house, he was losing his carefully constructed image of control. His golf buddies heard whispers, then outright accusations. The family dinners, once a stage for his pronouncements, became minefields of awkward silences and averted gazes. My mother, finally jolted out of her passive acceptance, began to ask questions, the ones she'd suppressed for years. He couldn't answer them without incriminating himself. He tried to appeal, to fight, but every legal avenue was closed to him. The evidence was too strong, his position too precarious. He had assumed his dominance was unquestionable, his word law. He was wrong. He became a pariah, his charm and his power evaporating like mist in the morning sun. He had no other assets, no other safety net. The house, the symbol of his supposed success, became his downfall. I never saw him again after that day. My mother and I had a brief, stilted conversation a few months later. She apologized, her voice barely above a whisper. I accepted it, not out of forgiveness, but out of a quiet understanding that some wounds never truly heal, they just become part of you. The satisfaction wasn't in his ruin, but in the quiet, unshakable knowledge that justice, in its own slow, deliberate way, had been served. He had wanted me to be good enough for him. I learned, instead, to be good enough for myself, and that proved to be his undoing.